Tom Walker stood at the entrance of the Galactic University of Physical Sciences, his worn backpack slung over one shoulder. The massive crystal building stretched up into the purple sky, its twisting spires defying what he knew about architecture. A steady stream of aliens of all shapes and sizes flowed past him, some floating, others walking on multiple legs, and a few rolling like living spheres. He checked his acceptance letter one more time. The holographic text flickered in the light of the three suns overhead. Congratulations on being selected as Earth's first exchange student. The words still didn't feel real. Excuse me, a soft voice chimed from behind. Are you the human student? Tom turned to find a tall, blue-skinned alien with 4 arms looking down at him. Her name tag identified her as Dean White, in both English and Standard Galactic. Yes, that's me, Tom replied, trying not to stare at her gently glowing skin. I'm Tom Walker. The Dean's expression shifted in what Tom guessed was concern. We've never had a Deathworlder attend before. Are you sure you want to proceed with enrollment? Tom blinked. A what? A Deathworlder, she explained, leading him inside the building. Species from high-gravity planets with extreme weather conditions, dangerous wildlife, and, she paused, searching for the right words, rather aggressive evolutionary paths. The main hall was filled with floating screens showing students performing what looked like impossible physical feats, bodies flowing through obstacle courses in perfect harmony with changing gravity fields. That's our physical achievement course, Dean White said, noting his interest. It's mandatory for all students, but perhaps we can make an exception in your case. Tom frowned. Why would I need an exception? The Dean stopped walking, all 4 hands clasping together nervously. Well, you see, no Deathworlder has ever passed it. The last attempt by a species from a heavy world resulted in several broken bones and a diplomatic incident. The course requires precise control over one's body in variable gravity conditions. Tom watched as a student on one of the screens gracefully navigated through what appeared to be a zero-gravity chamber. It reminded him of the swimming classes he took back home. I'd like to try, he said firmly. That's why I came here, to learn and experience new things. The Dean's skin pulsed with concerned colors. The exchange committee warned me you might say that. Very well, but you'll need to sign additional safety waivers, and we'll have medical staff standing by during your sessions. As they continued their tour, Tom noticed other students giving him a wide berth. Some whispered to each other, pointing at him when they thought he wasn't looking. He caught fragments of their conversations. From Earth, can you believe it? Gravity is almost 3 times standard. They still have predators there. The Dean showed him to his dormitory room, designed to accommodate various alien physiologies. The bed looked like it could adjust its firmness, and the gravity controls on the wall could simulate Earth normal conditions. Your schedule begins tomorrow, she said, handing him a tablet. First class is physical achievement at 0800 Standard Time. Professor Green will be informed about your special status. After the Dean left, Tom sat on his bed and scrolled through the course description. The physical achievement class seemed to focus on mastering movement through various gravitational fields and pressure environments. The objectives included achieving perfect harmony with variable physical constants and transcending basic motor limitations. Tom smiled, thinking about his childhood. He'd spent countless hours in swimming pools, learning to control his buoyancy. He'd done parkour in the city, understanding how to work with gravity rather than against it. He'd gone diving with his family, adjusting to pressure changes naturally. Maybe that's what the aliens didn't understand. Humans didn't fight against changing conditions, they adapted to them. On Earth, you had to learn to move through water, air, and everything in between. You had to be ready for weather changes, temperature shifts, and varying terrains. As he lay down to sleep, Tom wondered if being a Deathworlder might turn out to be an advantage rather than a handicap. Tomorrow would be interesting, to say the least. Outside his window, the 3 suns set one by one, painting the alien sky in colors he had no names for. Somewhere in the distance, he heard what sounded like musical laughter from his fellow students. Despite the dean's concerns and the strange looks, Tom felt excitement building in his chest. He was going to show them what a human could do. The Physical Achievement Gymnasium was unlike anything Tom had ever seen. The massive room stretched at least 5 stories high, divided into floating sections that moved and shifted like soap bubbles in the air. Each section glowed with a different color, marking what Tom guessed were different gravity zones. Professor Green stood before the class, his reed-thin body swaying gently despite the normal gravity. His skin was a pale green that seemed to ripple with each movement. And his eyes, all 4 of them, blinked in an alternating pattern as he surveyed the students. Today, Professor Green announced, his voice surprisingly deep, "We begin our journey toward physical perfection." His gaze settled on Tom. Even those of us who come from less refined environments. The other students, about 20 in total, stood in a perfect circle. Tom noticed that most of them had similar builds to Professor Green. Tall, slender, and seemingly weightless in their movements. Only one student stood out, a stocky, purple-skinned alien who looked almost as solid as Tom. Their name tag read Ray. "Observe the perfection course," Professor Green said, gesturing to the floating sections above them. "Each zone requires absolute control. Zone 1, Anti-Gravity Mastery. Zone 2, Variable Pressure Adaptation. Zone 3, Precision Movement through Shifting Gravitational Fields." The professor pressed a button on his wrist device, and a holographic demonstration appeared in the center of their circle. It showed a student from a previous class moving through the course. Their body flowed like water, each movement calculated and precise. "This is the ideal form," Professor Green explained. "Perfect harmony with the physical forces around us. No resistance, no struggle, only flow." Tom raised his hand. "Professor, that first zone, the anti-gravity one, it looks a lot like swimming." The class went silent. Professor Green's eyes blinked in rapid succession. "Swimming?" he asked, pronouncing the word carefully. "Ah, yes, the primitive practice of moving through liquid. This is nothing like that, Mr. Walker. This is about achieving perfect weightlessness, not splashing around in dihydrogen monoxide." A few students laughed, but Ray, the stocky alien, looked at Tom with interest. "Now," Professor Green continued, "we'll begin with basic anti-gravity adaptation. Please enter Zone 1 in groups of 3. The first group floated up gracefully. Tom watched as they moved through the zone, their bodies barely disturbing the space around them. It was beautiful, but something about it seemed inefficient to him. When it was his turn, Tom entered the zone with Ray and another student. The moment gravity disappeared, his body instinctively remembered years of swimming lessons. Instead of fighting the weightlessness, he let himself float, using small movements to control his position, just like treading water. "Mr. Walker," Professor Green's voice cut through the zone. "What are you doing? Those movements are completely wrong. You're disturbing the entire gravitational field." But Tom had already figured something out. While the other students used elaborate movements to stay stable, he barely needed to move at all. He remembered his old swimming coach's words. "The water's not your enemy. Work with it, not against it." Ray was watching him closely, struggling with the traditional technique. "How are you doing that?" they whispered. "Think of it like being in water," Tom whispered back. "Don't fight it. Just float." Ray's eyes widened, and they tried to copy Tom's relaxed stance. Almost immediately, their movements became more stable. Professor Green's color had shifted to a darker green. "Enough. Mr. Walker, please exit the zone. We'll need to work on correcting these primitive instincts of yours." As Tom floated down, he noticed something on the monitoring screens. His heart rate and energy expenditure were significantly lower than the other students. The computer had labeled his performance as highly inefficient, Class 4 violation of standard form, but the numbers told a different story. Back on the ground, Ray gave him a subtle nod. "Those swooning movements," they whispered. "They make sense. Our traditional form, it fights against the zone instead of working with it." Tom smiled. Maybe being a Deathworlder wasn't about being primitive. Maybe it was about understanding that sometimes the simplest solution was the best one. Professor Green was already calling the next group, pointedly ignoring Tom's successful navigation of the zone. But Tom didn't mind. He had a feeling this was just the beginning of proving what humans could do. A week had passed since Tom's first physical achievement class, and he was starting to see patterns in what the aliens considered impossible. He sat in the empty gymnasium during his free period, watching recordings of successful runs through the course on his tablet. "Mind if I join you?" Tom looked up to find Ray standing there, holding their own tablet. Their purple skin had a slight sheen of exhaustion from the morning's class. "Sure," Tom said, moving over on the bench. "I was just studying the pressure chamber section. Something about it reminds me of scuba diving." Ray's 4 eyes blinked in sequence. "What's scuba diving?" "It's how humans explore deep water back on Earth. We use equipment to breathe underwater and deal with the pressure changes." Tom pulled up an image of a scuba diver on his tablet. "See how they move. Slow, controlled movements, always working with the pressure, not against it." Ray leaned closer, fascinated. "That's exactly what you did in class today. Professor Green said you were doing it all wrong, but you got through the pressure chamber in half the time it takes most students." Tom nodded. "I noticed something about the traditional technique. Everyone tries to maintain perfect form while counteracting the pressure changes. But on Earth, we learn to let our bodies adjust naturally." "Could you?" Ray hesitated, looking around the empty gym. "Could you teach me?" Tom grinned. "Only if you help me understand why Professor Green's method is supposed to work." "Deal." They spent the next hour exchanging ideas. Ray explained the complex mathematical principles behind the traditional form, how it was designed to achieve perfect harmony with gravitational fields through precise muscular control. In return, Tom showed Ray videos of parkour athletes, swimmers, and mountain climbers. "See, humans didn't develop these skills in a lab," Tom explained. "We learned them through thousands of years of adapting to different environments. When we climb, we use momentum. When we swim, we work with the water. When we jump, you let gravity help instead of fighting it." Ray finished, eyes wide with understanding. "That's why you look so chaotic in the anti-gravity zone, but you barely use any energy." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Quick as lightning, Ray moved to the other end of the bench, pretending to study their tablet intently. Professor Green entered, followed by 2 other students, tall, willowy aliens named Blue and Silver. They were the top performers in the class, and they moved with the traditional flowing grace that the professor loved. "Ah, studying hard, I see," Professor Green said, his tone suggesting he doubted Tom was doing any such thing. "Mr. Walker, your form today was concerning. All that unnecessary movement in the pressure chamber." "But Professor," Blue interrupted, "his efficiency ratings were a malfunction," Professor Green said firmly. "The sensors clearly need recalibration. No Deathworlder technique could possibly be more efficient than our perfected methods." After they left, Ray slowly moved back to Tom's side. "You know what's funny? In all the years this course has been taught, no one has ever questioned why we do things this way." Tom thought about that. Maybe that's the real problem. Back on Earth, we have a saying, "Necessity is the mother of invention." When you live on a world that's constantly trying to kill you, you learn to adapt. You find solutions that work, even if they're not perfect. "I want to learn more," Ray said decisively. "And I think I know a few others who would too." Blue and Silver, they'd been talking about your techniques when Professor Green isn't around. They're curious. Tom smiled. "You know what? On Earth, some of our best gyms are in old warehouses and empty buildings. Places where people can practice without judgment." He gestured to the gymnasium around them. This place is empty every day during free period. Ray's skin rippled with excitement. An unofficial study group. Professor Green would have a fit if he found out. Then we'll just have to make sure the results speak for themselves, Tom said, already planning how to combine the best of both worlds. Earth's natural adaptability with the aliens' precise understanding of physics. As they left the gym, Tom couldn't help but feel optimistic. Sometimes the best teachers were those who remembered what it was like to be beginners, and sometimes the best techniques were those that evolved naturally, not in a laboratory. The impossible course was about to get a lot more interesting. The emergency alert echoed through the gymnasium during morning class. Professor Green's skin had turned almost white with panic as he rushed to the pressure chamber controls. Inside, Tom was struggling through the course. At least, that's what it looked like to everyone who didn't know better. "Shut it down," Professor Green shouted. "The Deathworlder is in distress. His movements are completely erratic." But before anyone could react, Tom emerged from the chamber, breathing normally and checking his time on the wrist display. He looked up to find the entire class staring at him, Professor Green's 4 eyes wide with disbelief. "Is something wrong?" Tom asked, genuinely confused. "Wrong?" Professor Green's skin rippled with agitation. "Your form was absolutely chaotic. You were flailing about like a swimmer," Blue said quietly, then quickly looked down when the professor turned to face them. Tom realized what had happened. To the aliens, his efficient movements, the same ones he'd been teaching to Ray and a small group of interested students during their secret practice sessions, looked like desperate struggling. They didn't understand that humans had evolved to move this way, to adapt to changing conditions naturally rather than fighting against them. "Professor," Tom said carefully, "could we check the performance metrics?" The professor hesitated, then pulled up the holographic display. The numbers were clear. Tom's energy efficiency was 50% better than the class average, and his completion time was near the top of the records. "Impossible," Professor Green muttered. "The sensors must be malfunctioning again. This goes against everything we know about physical achievement." Ray stepped forward, their purple skin slightly darker with nervousness. "Actually, Professor, I've been studying Tom's technique. It's not chaos. It's adaptation. Watch." Before anyone could stop them, Ray entered the pressure chamber. Instead of using the traditional rigid form, they moved like Tom had taught them, flowing with the pressure changes, using minimal movements, letting their body adjust naturally. They emerged with the second-best time of the day. The class burst into excited whispers. Silver raised their hand. "Professor, we've been watching Tom during free period. His methods, they make sense when you understand the principles behind them." Professor Green's color shifted through several shades of green. "This is unacceptable. These primitive techniques go against centuries of refined physical theory." "But what if our theories are incomplete?" It was Blue who spoke up this time. "The data shows that Tom's approach works, not just for him, but for Ray too. Maybe instead of dismissing it, we should try to understand why." The professor turned to his computer console, pulling up recordings of Tom's previous attempts. He played them side by side with the traditional technique demonstrations. "Look at this chaos. The irregular movements, the seemingly random adjustments." "They're not random," Tom explained, pointing to the screen. "See how I'm moving with the pressure waves instead of trying to stay rigid. It's like diving in the ocean. The water's going to move you no matter what, so you learn to work with it." A small crowd had gathered around the display. Even students from other classes had stopped to watch. Tom could see the moment when understanding began to dawn on their faces. In the anti-gravity zone, one student said, "He's using the same principles we use, just more naturally." And in the precision movement section, another added, "His technique actually uses less energy because he's not fighting against the momentum." Professor Green stood silent, his 4 eyes fixed on the efficiency readings that kept appearing on screen. Years of teaching the perfect form were being challenged by something that looked completely wrong, but somehow worked better. Dean White's voice suddenly came from the gymnasium entrance. "Professor Green, a word please." As the professor left with the dean, Tom heard him trying to explain the situation. "Dean, you don't understand. These Deathworlder techniques, they're completely unorthodox." And yet, the dean's voice drifted back. "The data speaks for itself, doesn't it?" Tom looked around at his classmates, who were now openly discussing his methods. Ray caught his eye and grinned. What had started as a misunderstanding was turning into something bigger, a bridge between two very different ways of thinking about physical movement. Blue approached Tom, their usual graceful movements now showing hints of his more natural style. Would you be willing to teach us more?" Officially this time. Tom smiled. Sometimes the best discoveries happen by accident, when people were willing to look past their preconceptions and see the value in different approaches. "Of course," he said. "Let's start from the beginning." The next day, Tom arrived at the gymnasium to find it unusually crowded. Students from other classes lined the observation areas, and even a few professors stood near the entrance, talking in hushed tones. Dean White was there too, her blue skin glowing with what Tom had learned to recognize as curiosity. Professor Green stood in the center of the gym, his color a lighter shade than usual. "Given recent developments," he announced, "today's class will be slightly different. We will be conducting a formal analysis of both traditional and," he paused, "alternative techniques." Ray moved to stand next to Tom. "Word got around about yesterday," they whispered. "Half the school wants to see the Deathworlder method in action." Blue and Silver joined them, along with several other students who had been secretly practicing Tom's techniques during free periods. Their movements already showed signs of changing, less rigid, more natural, combining the best of both worlds. "First," Professor Green said, activating the course, "we will demonstrate the traditional form." He gestured to Silver, who had been the top student before Tom arrived. Silver moved through the course beautifully, their form perfect by traditional standards. The observers nodded appreciatively at the precise, calculated movements. Their final time was excellent, one of the best ever recorded using the classical technique. "Now," Professor Green continued, his voice slightly strained, "Mr. Walker will demonstrate his method." Tom stepped forward, feeling everyone's eyes on him. He took a deep breath and entered the first zone. This time, he didn't hold back. He let his body move naturally through the anti-gravity section, using the swimming techniques he'd grown up with. In the pressure chamber, he adapted like a diver adjusting to depth changes. Through the precision movement zone, he flowed like a parkour athlete, using momentum and natural balance. The crowd gasped as his time appeared on the screen, nearly 30% faster than Silver's, with 40% less energy expenditure. "Impossible," one of the observing professors exclaimed. "The calculations, the theory." "Perhaps," Dean White spoke up, "our theories need updating." She turned to Tom. "Mr. Walker, could you explain your approach?" Tom looked at the curious faces around him and remembered how his swimming coach used to teach beginners. Instead of trying to fight against different conditions, he explained, humans learned to work with them. "We evolved on a planet where gravity, pressure, and conditions change all the time." He pulled up an image on the main display. "This is a human swimming underwater, something we do for fun. Notice how the movements look chaotic, but are actually very efficient." He showed another image. "And this is parkour, how we adapt to moving through urban environments. Different context, same principle. Work with your environment, not against it." Ray stepped forward. "I've been learning Tom's techniques. At first, they felt wrong because they weren't perfect like we were taught. But look at this." Ray entered the course, demonstrating a fascinating blend of traditional alien grace and human adaptability. Their movements were fluid but natural, precise but not rigid. The class watched in amazement as Ray posted a time almost as good as Tom's. The interesting thing, Blue added, pulling up comparison data, is that we're not just copying Earth techniques. We're creating something new, a combination of our understanding of physics and their natural adaptability. Professor Green had been unusually quiet. Now he moved forward, his color shifting thoughtfully. "Mr. Walker," he said slowly, "when I first saw your methods, I thought they were primitive and dangerous. But after analyzing the data," he paused, his professional pride clearly wrestling with scientific curiosity. "Perhaps," he continued, "there is something to be learned from how your species adapted to your challenging environment. Your techniques, while unorthodox, demonstrate an efficiency that our traditional methods lack." Dean White stepped forward, her glow brightening. "I believe this calls for a significant update to our curriculum. Professor Green, would you be interested in developing a new course? One that combines both approaches?" The professor's color brightened slightly. "A comparative study of physical adaptation techniques. Yes, that could be quite fascinating." Tom looked around at his classmates, Ray beaming with pride, Blue and Silver already discussing new combinations of techniques, and the observers taking notes furiously. What had started as a misunderstanding was turning into a revolution in how the galactic community thought about physical movement. Sometimes, he realized, the best solutions came not from perfection, but from adaptation. And sometimes, being from a death world wasn't a disadvantage. It was just a different kind of perfect. The day of the final assessment arrived with an atmosphere of excitement that Tom had never felt before in the gymnasium. The viewing galleries were packed with students, professors, and even a few representatives from the Galactic Education Board who had heard about the Deathworlder revolution in physical achievement training. "Remember," Ray said as they stretched before the test, "today isn't just about passing. It's about showing them a better way." The assessment course had been modified. Instead of the standard 3 zones, it now included 5 different challenges, each designed to test both traditional form and adaptive techniques. Professor Green, who had spent the last few weeks studying recordings of Earth sports and movement patterns, had helped design it. "Students," Professor Green announced, his color a confident emerald, "today's assessment will be different from any before. We're not just testing your ability to achieve perfect form. We're testing your ability to adapt, to find the most efficient way through each challenge." The first student to attempt the course was Silver, who had been practicing hard to blend both styles. They moved through the anti-gravity zone, using a combination of traditional grace and Tom's swimming techniques. In the pressure chamber, they adapted smoothly to the changes, their movements fluid but controlled. "Excellent work," Professor Green noted as Silver finished with a time well below the old course records. A perfect blend of precision and adaptation. One by one, the students who had learned from Tom demonstrated their mastery. Blue surprised everyone by adding a twist to the momentum zone, using a Parker-inspired move to conserve energy. Others showed their own innovations, each finding unique ways to combine Earth's natural adaptability with alien precision. The representatives from the Education Board whispered among themselves, taking notes and recording everything on their devices. Dean White's glow had brightened to an almost brilliant blue as she watched her students excel. Finally, it was Ray's turn. As Tom's first student and friend, everyone waited to see what they would do. Ray entered the course with confidence, their purple skin gleaming under the lights. What followed was amazing. Ray moved through the course like water flowing around obstacles, their movements a perfect synthesis of alien grace and human adaptability. In the high-gravity zone, they used momentum like a parkour artist. Through the precision challenges, they maintained perfect form while allowing natural adjustments. When Ray finished, the gymnasium erupted in applause. Their time wasn't just good, it was extraordinary. "And now," Professor Green announced, "Mr. Walker." Tom stepped up to the starting position, feeling surprisingly calm. He had come a long way from being the strange Deathworlder who everyone thought would fail. Now he wasn't just showing what humans could do. He was demonstrating how different species could learn from each other. The course activated, and Tom began. In the anti-gravity zone, he moved like he was in the deepest ocean, each movement efficient and purposeful. Through the pressure chamber, he adapted instantly to the changes, his body responding naturally to each shift. But it was in the new sections where Tom really showed what he had learned. He combined the aliens' understanding of physics with human instinct, creating movements that were both beautiful and incredibly efficient. In the high-gravity zone, he used techniques inspired by both parkour and traditional alien forms. The final zone was the most challenging, a complex combination of varying gravity fields and pressure waves. Tom moved through it like he had been born to it, his movements a dance between precision and adaptation. When he finished, the gymnasium was silent for a moment before exploding into cheers. His time hadn't just broken records, it had shattered them. Professor Green's color shifted to a deep, rich green that Tom had never seen before. "Mr. Walker," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the gym, "when you first arrived, I thought a Deathworlder could never master this course." He paused, all four eyes blinking in sequence. "I was wrong. You haven't just mastered it. You've helped us reinvent it." Dean White stepped forward, her glow pulsing with excitement. "The Education Board representatives have seen enough," she announced. "They've approved our proposal for a new advanced movement course, combining traditional techniques with what we're now calling adaptive physical theory." Tom looked around at his classmates, at Ray's proud smile, at Blue and Silver's excited discussions about future possibilities, at the other students already practicing new combinations of movements. What had started as an impossible class for a Deathworlder had become something much more important, proof that different approaches could make everyone stronger. The impossible course wasn't impossible after all. It just needed a different perspective. 3 months after the final assessment, the Galactic University of Physical Sciences looked very different. The main gymnasium had been renovated to include both traditional and adaptive training zones. Students from across the galaxy now came to study what they called the Earth Fusion style of movement. Tom stood at the entrance of the gym, just like he had on his first day, but this time as an assistant instructor. Professor Green had insisted on it, saying that proper teaching required both traditional expertise and practical experience. "Ready for your first official class?" Ray asked, walking up beside him. Their purple skin had a healthy sheen from regular practice in the adaptive zones. They were now the top student in the advanced course and helped teach beginners the basics of combined movement. "Almost," Tom replied, watching as students filed in. The class was a mix of species he had never seen before, some floating, some walking on multiple legs, and even a few other Deathworlders who had been inspired to apply after hearing about his success. Professor Green appeared, his color a confident shade of green that had become normal since the curriculum change. "Ah, Mr. Walker, or should I say, Assistant Professor Walker. Shall we begin?" The class gathered in a circle, just like they had months ago. But this time, there was no tension, no skepticism, only excitement. "Welcome to Advanced Adaptive Physics," Professor Green announced. "Today, you'll learn that there is no single, perfect form. Instead, we'll explore how different species have evolved to handle various physical challenges." Tom stepped forward. "On Earth, we have a saying. The only constant is change. Our planet taught us that adapting to change is more important than achieving perfect form." A small six-legged student raised an appendage. "But how can we learn Earth techniques without Earth gravity?" "That's the beautiful part," Ray answered. "We're not just copying Earth methods or sticking to traditional forms. We're creating something new." To demonstrate, Tom and Ray entered the modified course together. They moved through the zones in perfect sync, each using their species' natural advantages while incorporating techniques from the other. Where Tom used his human adaptability, Ray complemented it with precise alien movements. Where Ray applied traditional form, Tom added Earth-style efficiency. The students watched in amazement as the pair completed the course with the best synchronized time ever recorded. "See," Professor Green said, his color brightening. What we once thought was impossible wasn't actually impossible. We were just approaching it from a limited perspective. Dean White, who had come to watch the first class, stepped forward. The Galactic Education Board has officially recognized this as a breakthrough in physical education. Universities across the galaxy are requesting our training materials. Tom smiled, remembering how fast everything had changed. The research papers analyzing human movement patterns. The discovery that other Deathworld species had similar adaptive abilities. The gradual realization that what seemed like chaos was actually a highly efficient response to changing conditions. The most important lesson, he told the class, isn't about movement at all. It's about being willing to learn from each other. Every species, every planet, has something to teach us. Blue and Silver, now graduate students developing new training programs, demonstrated some of the latest combinations they had created. Their movements showed how far the technique had evolved, no longer simply Earth or alien methods, but truly something new. When I first came here, Tom continued, everyone thought a Deathworlder couldn't pass this course. Now we know that being from a challenging environment isn't a disadvantage, it's just a different kind of advantage. As the class began their first exercises, Tom watched the students helping each other. A floating alien showing a Deathworlder how to achieve perfect balance. A multi-legged being learning Earth-style momentum techniques from a human student. Professor Green moved to stand beside him. You know, Mr. Walker, when you first arrived, I thought you would disrupt everything we had built here. His color shifted to a warm, friendly shade. I was right, but not in the way I expected. Sometimes the best disruptions are the ones that make us grow. Ray joined them, watching the students practice. So, what's next? More impossible courses to master. Tom laughed. I don't think anything's really impossible anymore. Not when we work together. Above them, through the gymnasium's crystal ceiling, the three suns of this alien world painted the sky in colors Tom still had no names for. But that was okay. Some things didn't need perfect names or perfect forms. They just needed to work, to adapt, and to bring people together. After all, that's what Deathworlders did best.